Greetings from Singapore. This is probably the most ironic moment in all of human history to be talking about the next great migration. Mankind has just done something we never thought we could do in response to something we hoped would never happen. What did we do? We managed to seal almost all international borders, to lock down the world population at its peak. We did it, but it's been very painful. In fact, if you look at December 2019, we had reached record levels of international mobility. 1.5 billion people, tourists, students, business travelers, had crossed international boundaries. 275 million people living outside of their country of origin. And then it all stopped. It didn't just stop, it reversed to some degree. So in fact, right now, we are in the middle of what you might call a great reset. Why would a new great migration follow such an unprecedented reset? First reason is because you do not get to pick your crisis. Sadly, you may remember actually, around February of this year, people said, well, COVID seems to be the cure for climate change. The skies have cleared in so many parts of the world. Well, sadly, if we go back to some of those same places, business as usual has returned. So we are in a world of COVID, of climate change, of economic crisis, and of other natural disasters, political unrest, and so on at the same time. You do not get to pick your crisis. What all of these dilemmas, challenges that humanity faces all have in common is that they historically are major drivers of migration. Why do people move historically? And we know the answer. We have about 75,000 years of history of people moving and migrating. And the reasons are many. It can be, indeed, response to labor shortages, filling the demographic vacuum in some places. Climate change has been a factor many times. Just think about ice ages. Political unrest, civil wars and conflicts, pandemics, moving from red zones to green zones. There are many reasons why people move, and the truth is that right now, all of them are in full effect. And so we have this pent-up demand for people to move. The question is, where are they going from? Where are they going to? Now, as I said, all of these forces that drive migration are happening at the same time, and it's very hard to predict how they're going to interact with each other. We have these economic crises and volatility, sovereign debt, banking crises, protectionism, economic inequality. We have the environmental challenges that relate to climate change, rising sea levels, food scarcity, and so forth. Technological disruptions like labor automation. These also are forces that push people away from where they live to somewhere else. And of course, geopolitics, an ever-present risk. State failure and collapse, to take just an obvious example that we've seen repeatedly in the last decades. And the truth is that, again, you don't get to pick just one bucket of crisis to focus on one at a time. They're all happening at the same time, and they're leading to a world that is highly unpredictable and volatile. And so the next great human migration may be the result of many of the smaller or episodes of migration that are to come, resulting from any or all of these situations. So it's easy for people to say today, well, the solution is let's just move to the suburbs, right? Get out of cities, leave the overcrowded areas and your cramped apartments because of COVID and lockdown and work from home, and it's all so stressful. But that's not really the way people think in the long term, because of course we are very much an urban species. If you can say just a couple of things to generalize about the human population over thousands of years, it's that we have an urge to cluster into cities. And we have an urge and a desire to stay connected to each other physically as well as digitally. But let's take this very seriously, because there are cities in coastal areas or that are suffering from drought or other conditions around the world that people may need to abandon, may need to leave. And there are opportunities to regenerate populations or to increase our concentration in more stable or fertile areas. And indeed, there are digital technologies present that make it possible for us to work, depending on what industry you're in, from anywhere in the world. So some of the data does point to an increase now of people moving into rural, suburban, ex-urban areas. Some of the robotic technologies like drone delivery and delivery bots that can make life very convenient in suburban areas. There is something to be said for that. But it's not necessarily for everyone. And those suburbs may indeed become the next second-tier and first-tier cities of the future. A lot of times, especially this year, you hear people saying COVID could be the death of the city. And I say, well, do you mean the map of today's leading cities is frozen in time, and the leading cities of today were the same ones from 2,000 years ago and 1,000 years ago and 500 years ago? Because the truth is that urbanization and the patterns of human migration have always been shifting the balance of power and the economic weight among many different cities. And yes, indeed, some cities will be losers from COVID, but there are new winners as well. So it's not about the death of the city. It's about which cities are getting the post-COVID world right, and also planning to cope with climate change and migratory populations and other stresses at the same time. Fortunately, we have built up the knowledge to help cities prepare for the future and to cope with these kinds of disruptions and challenges. One thing we know for sure, if there's one common priority for mankind, and we are an urban species after all, it is sustainable urbanization. And what has become apparent in recent decades is that we're not spending enough on some of the key foundations of urban sustainability, whether that is bringing down the energy consumed and the emissions generated from our heating and cooling and our transportation, or it could be more social factors like having adequate health care and adequate affordable housing. These are some of the things that we know cities need to do to continue to attract and replenish their populations and be attractive to the next generation. But many cities aren't yet doing it, but we know we can. We know that buildings can be green. We know that people can be cycling and walking and have more walkable communities. A lot of those changes are now starting to accelerate because of COVID. So it's a real example of learning. You're hearing more and more, of course, about 15-minute cities or neighborhoods. And that, while there was the seeds of that and some efforts around that in the last several years, now those will accelerate. So can we turn crisis into opportunity? Can more cities of the world become the sustainable cities of the future? There's no question that that is our leading priority. And let's remember that the money is there to make this happen. The liquidity is there. Suddenly, the world's debt stock has ballooned yet again, the way it did after the financial crisis. Let's ask ourselves in every such situation, are we deploying this capital the way we should? Are we doing it in a way that empowers people, that retrofits infrastructure, that creates good jobs, and that makes our habitats more sustainable? Because those are binary choices, yes and no. For every dollar we spend, let's make sure we're doing it in a way that promotes sustainable habitats, especially our cities. Now, as I said at the beginning, you don't get to choose your crisis. Mankind is on the move. Right now, what you see on the upper left map, that is the distribution of the entire human population, 8+ billion people. Every one of us is actually a pixel on that map. You can see where we are geographically concentrated. So, of course, most of the world population is Asian. You can see much of the population is concentrated in coastal areas. Now, I want you to think about the impact of the image on the bottom right. That is a scenario of where the global organic food production supply is going to come from if world temperatures rise up to 4 degrees from the United Nations IPCC baseline year, which is 1990. Now, many people believe that we're going to inevitably reach the 2-degree mark and possibly higher. And we know that drought is afflicting many parts of the world. The world's largest food-producing countries today are the United States, Brazil, Australia, India, China, and a couple of others. But what about, look at this map. Where is the food going to come from if world temperatures continue to rise? It could be that the Arctic Circle is a large geography of food production, the largest, whereas, of course, again, today's world population is concentrated almost entirely south of everything that is in green on this map. So the fact is, we have to come to terms with a world, with a future, in which we have to resort ourselves and realign our geographies. The human geography of where we're located, the political geography of our borders, the economic geography of cities, all of these are out of sync with each other. The solution is not, of course, that everyone suddenly moves to the northern hemisphere, to the far north, to Canada, to Russia, and so forth. That's not practical. That's not what's going to happen. But this is an illustration of just how, again, out of sync our different layers of geography are, and how we need to think about making our habitats more sustainable, more livable for the large population we have today. As I said before, we have tens of thousands of years of history of migration from north to south, east to west, in all directions. But ultimately, the two great trends have been that we need to live near bodies of water, we need fresh water supply, and we tend to concentrate in cities. Now, I also mentioned this, the motivations for why people move, such as demographic imbalances, political unrest, economic crises, automation, climate change, the pandemic. Now let's start to talk about what we're looking for. If we could start today again and build cities from scratch, right, what would be the key elements? What is sustainable urbanization, the term I used earlier? What does it look like in reality? Well, people are looking for adequate food supplies. They're looking for sustainability in terms of the environment. They're looking for fresh water supply, for circularity in the economy of goods and the usage of materials. Healthcare being adequate, universal. Jobs, of course. Friendliness and openness to migrants and affordability. These are just some of the basics that we have to get right in all of our cities in order to have them be sustainable and livable. Now, who is the primary driver of the future waves of migration, and perhaps one of the geographies where we most need to adapt and deploy the lessons that we may have learned from cities elsewhere in the world around sustainable urbanization? It's certainly Asia. Inside this rectangle, you have more than 5 billion people. The majority of the human population lives here on this map. And interestingly, that's always going to be true. It's not just true today, it will be true for our lifetime and our children's lifetimes, because actually the world population is starting to plateau. It may peak at roughly 9 to 9.5 billion people over the next 20 to 30 years. So whether it is Asians staying in Asia or Asians on the move to cities around the world, coming to a city near you, to your city, the fact is that this geography really matters as a locus of the need to adapt sustainability practices from all over the world, and whether or not we get that right, Asians increasing their presence around the world. And we have to think also about then the global supply chain dimension of these cities. Now, what we have right now is a world where cities have not adequately factored in the economic cost of their activity, the environmental externalities of their activity. There's a lot of efforts in the financial markets like ESG to quantify, if you will, to use full cycle accounting, life cycle analysis to understand exactly just how costly our global supply chain reach is. And just as significant as any of that corporate activity is the locus of the populations who use those and consume those resources and buy those products from those companies that are, of course, our cities and our populations in cities. So the truth is that even if you live in one city and you have self-sufficiency internally, or you're able to access any goods and services you want at any given time, remember that those all came from somewhere. And the next step in reconciling whatever geography we put ourselves in with the resources that of the places that they come from is to think much more holistically about our distribution around the world and about the balance, having a harmonious balance, if you will, between cities and resource-rich areas. That's why ever more economists are starting to try to quantify this. One estimate suggests that the natural capital of the world, the resources that we leverage to have our comfortable urban lives, actually drive or are the foundation of half of the global economy, half of global GDP. It's efforts like this that are actually being combined with data science and satellite imagery and mapping that will really help us to understand just how connected we are to our ecology and just what a heavy footprint our urban life has if it's not reconstituted and transformed in a sustainable manner. What are some of the ways we might go about doing this? Technology is going to play a critical role there as well. Now, you may have noticed that during the pandemic, even though 2019 had been a year of ample harvests around the world, because borders were closed, food supplies, food trade were restricted. Whether it was potatoes in one country or wheat in another country, seeds in another, oils, these things were cut off from being delivered. Food was wasted, right? Because we didn't have the mechanisms to safely transport these volumes of food around the world. So many countries are now realizing that they need to accelerate their plans to rethink their spatial organization, their investments, to invest more in having localized food production and supply. This can be a good thing if it's done sustainably. This may mean that certain land that's been used to build up cities needs to be given back and needs to be turned into farmland so that we can be more self-sufficient in producing food locally. Technology can play a role because we have been doing a lot of work in the last 10 years or so with hydroponic and aquaponic food production. Countries like Singapore have been accelerating their plans to produce more food locally. And this is a trend that's going to spread all over the world. This can show that in the future we can have more localized and self-sufficient urban communities that don't consume as much water as industrial agriculture, but can still produce a growing share of the food that their communities require and consume, but can potentially do so in a way in which all of the greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with transporting food supply all over the world are spared and are reduced. There are many examples of that. So the cities of the future could have this dense footprint, be built in areas that are safe from rising sea levels, can be more circular in terms of their consumption of energy and of water supplies, grow more of their own local food. They can also recycle more, the circular economy, again, of materials, but also for the usage of water. For example, treating wastewater and reusing it for agriculture and so forth. Renewable energy and other investments should all be the top priorities to achieve this goal of sustainable urbanization around the world. And as I've been emphasizing throughout, we know how to do this. There are innovative cities for every category of investment, for every measure, for every policy that needs to be undertaken. There is a global process of learning underway. I call that diplomacity. What does that mean? Well, actually, the history of diplomacy goes back about 4,000 years to the trading, to the commercial and cultural networks between the city-states of ancient Mesopotamia. So today we think of diplomacy as that which federal governments do with each other, but much of the history of diplomacy is cities actually transacting with each other. And today, again, with most of the world population being urban, with cities being the progressive engines of governance, with cities being the drivers of economies, we have seen the growing power of mayors and the progressive policies at the municipal level being shared around the world. Today, there are about 250 intercity learning networks in the world. That's actually more than the number of intergovernmental organizations that exist in the world today. So diplomacity has made a very big comeback. And sustainable urbanization is the critical set of lessons that cities are now sharing with each other. The C40 is obviously one of the most prominent examples of that. And over time, we will find that even though we live in a world of more borders than ever in history, right? More countries, more nations, more sovereignty than ever, we also have more cities that are connected to each other, whether it is through stock exchanges, internet cables, or airline routes, than ever before as well. And that's where the action is when it comes to pioneering a world that is more sustainable. Cities that are getting it right, sharing their lessons, sharing their technologies, sharing their best practices with each other. So I'm hopeful that even though we live in a world of constant crisis and many unfolding crises, our networks can move faster, we can be smarter, and we can indeed achieve that goal of sustainable urbanization. And the next great migration that is set to unfold is going to be one that's hopefully going to be a peaceful one and not a chaotic scramble, the way managing this global COVID lockdown has been. So let's learn the lessons from each other, let's get it right, and let's build a sustainable world for everyone, no matter which city you live in. Thank you.